This channel is part of the History Hit network.
In the first half of the 16th century, England had been weakened by years of tyranny and religious persecution. As a seafaring nation, it came to be overshadowed and threatened by the already mighty empire of Spain. Despite this, there were still Englishmen who looked outwards, across the waters, awaiting their chance to rise up and lead their nation against the tide of history. They were a new breed whose moment was about to come. And first, forever, among them, was Sir Francis Drake. After the death of Henry VIII, England suffered a period of civil and religious unrest under first Edward and then, more damagingly, Mary, whose ambition it was to save England from Protestantism by handing it over to the Spanish king. English seafaring expeditions suffered badly from her disinterest. Even John Cabot, whose voyages had provided grounds for an English claim to North America, was ignored. When, instead, the French capitalized on Cabot's discoveries, his son Sebastian left England in disgust to serve Spain, which had already financed Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe. Into this miserable period, somewhere between 1540 and 1545, Francis Drake was born, on a farm in Crowndale near the Devon town of Tavistock. He was one of 12 children. This was the time of the Marian persecutions, and in 1549, his father Edmund, a Protestant, was driven out of the county by a Catholic mob and fled to Gillingham in Kent. There, living with his family in an old hulk, he became a preacher to the workers at what later became Chatham Dockyard. Drake's family survived persecution, and his father actually went on to become the vicar of Upchurch. But Drake himself was clearly marked by this early experience, and by accounts, heard within that seafaring community of the cruelty of the Spanish Inquisition and the predatory, hovering threat of invasion by Spain. Drake remained all his life a devout Protestant who detested Catholicism. It was an attitude which would play no small part in shaping both his own destiny and that of England. When Queen Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, a period of calm and stability began. England was still a weak power, but a recovery began to take place. While avoiding open conflict with Spain, the Queen turned a blind eye to private incursions against the Spanish king. In this way, she created an atmosphere in which men like Drake were turned into practiced and expert seamen by becoming privateers. Thus, the Old English tradition of piracy, which lay at the heart of England's struggle to assert itself, was harnessed by the Crown. Drake's opportunity to join this preparation for world plunder came through his cousin, John Hawkins, whose family was financing voyages to the west coast of Africa. At this time, nearly all sea expeditions were privately sponsored, and Drake's career began in the manner typical of most professional seamen, serving aboard a ship belonging to a relation, where he picked up what skills and experience he could.
History Hit is like Netflix just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history, just for you. Whether you're looking to dive into life and crime in Victorian London, or the forgotten history that deserves to be heard, History Hit has a documentary for you, just a click away. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you can't find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
In October 1567, Drake sailed with John Hawkins on a slave trading expedition. Most of Hawkins' ships were the new race-built galleons, which were low in the water and very responsive. But the Queen had lent him 2 very old ships of the high-charged kind, built by Henry VIII. The Jesus of Lubeck and the Minion were floating fortresses. With their high poops and forecastles, they were very effective against boarders. But they were clumsy ships, and most importantly, considering their age, their cannons put a strain on their timbers. Most of these great ships had been replaced by this time. Before the voyage was over, Hawkins and Drake had good reason to wish the Lubeck had been among them. During the outward voyage, Hawkins made Drake master and commander of one of the smaller ships, the Judith. Then, having collected 500 slaves in Guinea, he made for the Spanish Main. There, despite the knowledge that the King of Spain had forbidden trading, Hawkins bribed, cajoled, and increasingly bluffed the local authorities with shows of force into accepting the trade their colonists eagerly desired. On reaching Rio de la Hacha, however, Drake requested permission to replenish his water supply and was instead fired on. When the rest of the squadron arrived, Hawkins in response put ashore a landing party to subdue the town. He then continued trading forcibly, selling the governor himself 80 slaves at a price of 5,000 gold pesos. Here, the outset of his career, Drake was already participating in, and no doubt learning well, his semi-piratical trade. But shortly after the raid on Rio de la Hacha, he was to learn still another, more terrible lesson. The Jesus of Lubeck at last became unsafe. Had the ship been privately owned, it would certainly have been abandoned. But the Lubeck was the Queen's ship, and would have to be paid for if lost. Hawkins hurriedly put in to the port of Vera Cruz at San Juan de Ulua to make repairs. No sooner had he done so than he was joined by the annual Spanish treasure fleet from Seville, under the new Viceroy of the Indies, Don Martin Enrique. The mutually embarrassed leaders came to a wary truce agreement, which allowed Hawkins to continue his repairs and leave. Hostages were duly exchanged. This was a mistake. The English hostages were immediately thrown in jail by the Spanish, who had no intention of returning them, and Hawkins had to disarm one of the Spanish hostages after inviting him to eat at his table. The Spanish broke the truce and attacked by night. During the course of a bitter, largely hand-to-hand battle, Hawkins ordered the Judith to sea alone in order to save her, and aghast, Drake piloted her back to England. The English sailors captured at San Juan de Ulua were tortured by the Mexican Inquisition. They were then given sentences of up to 200 lashes and 10 years in the galleys. Some were returned to Spain, where they were burned alive in the marketplace execution known as auto da fe. This defeat of his first command, brought about by Spanish betrayal, affected Drake intensely. He never again trusted the word of a Spaniard. On his return to England, He asked for permission to carry out a voyage of reprisal, but the Queen's policy of officially friendly relations with Spain made this impossible. Instead, Drake took matters into his own hands and spent a year on secret voyages across the Atlantic. By 1572, he had established a harbour base, Port Pheasant, from which he hoped to attack the inland Spanish treasure routes from Panama and Peru. In that year, he set sail in another of Hawkins's ships, the Pasco, accompanied by his brother John, in command of the Swan. On arrival at the base, Port Pheasant, he discovered a letter in the form of a lead plate nailed to a tree. Captain Drake, if you fortune to come to this port, make haste away, for the Spaniards which you had with you here last year have betrayed this place, and taken away all that you left here. I departed from hence this present 7th of July, 1572. Your very loving friend, John Garrett. In the face of yet more Spanish betrayal, Drake took advantage of what surprise was left to him, and pushed on for Nombre de Dios, a few miles northwest. There he led a few small boats upriver, and with a small complement of men, stormed the town by night. After braving a volley of shot, in which he was hit in the leg, Drake and his men succeeded in reaching the treasury, into which they could see by candlelight.
It was a huge heap of silver, over 70 foot in length, 10 foot in breadth, and 12 foot height, piled up against the wall. Each bar was between 35 and 40 pounds weight. At sight hereof, our captain commanded straightly that none of us should touch a bar of silver, but stand upon our weapons, because the town were full of people.
But there, Drake's luck turned. A thunderstorm broke, wetting powder and affecting bowstrings, and his men, heavily outnumbered, began to lose their nerve. Drake tried to rally them, but as he spoke, he began to faint from loss of blood from his leg wound. Helpless without Drake to lead them, his men carried him back to the boats and made their escape. Drake did not give up, but shifted his attention to a fort called Venta Cruces, where the mule trains from the north met those from Panama. By befriending the Cimarroni Indians, who hated their Spanish conquerors, Drake was able to negotiate the hazardous forests which lay in his path overland. But during this time, he lost 30 men to yellow fever. When the mule trains finally arrived, Drake marched through jungle for a week, with only 18 Englishmen and 30 Indians. At the journey's end, he climbed into an Indian lookout post which, incredibly, to his Elizabethan eyes, also afforded a view of the Atlantic. But it was the Pacific which most inspired him.
Almighty God, of your goodness give me life and leave once to sail in an English ship in that sea.
Drake's first attempt on the mule trains was unsuccessful. The second, made in partnership with a Huguenot corsair, Captain Atestu, succeeded, and 15 tons of silver was captured. What could not be carried was buried for a return visit. Although some of this was discovered by the Spanish, Drake was nevertheless able to recover 13 bars of silver and several more of gold, to the value of 150,000 pesos. "23 days after leaving the Spanish Main, Drake returned to Plymouth. It was a Sunday, and the churches emptied as people gathered to welcome him home. In 1577, English relations with Spain deteriorated suddenly, and Drake was summoned before the Queen. Drake himself later described the meeting to friends.
Coming into her presence, she said, "Drake, so it is that I would gladly be revenged upon the King of Spain for divers injuries that I received." And said, further, that I was the only man who could do this exploit, and withal craved my advice therein. So I told Her Majesty of the small good that could be done in Spain, but the only way was to annoy him in the Indies.
From this scrap of information, it is difficult to guess precisely what effect this meeting had on Drake's imminent voyage, except that it became instantly, as a result, a hostile one. But if Drake planned the extent of his next expedition, he cannot have expected an easy voyage. He was well aware that Magellan, who had made the triumphant first circumnavigation of the globe 60 years before, had been himself murdered in the Philippines, after a voyage in which his starving crew was reduced to eating leather. For the expedition, Drake commanded the Pelican, a 100-ton ship with 18 guns. John Winter captained the Elizabeth, John Thomas the Marigold, and Tom Moore, the storeship the Swan, later exchanged for a Portuguese craft, the Christopher. All were ships of the most modern design, dependable in the water and strong. They were also beautifully decorated and furnished ships, particularly the Pelican, which, when he entered the Magellan Straits, Drake famously renamed the Golden Hind. The Hind was a truly luxuriously appointed ship, fit indeed for a Queen's representative.
Expert musicians, rich furniture, all the vessels of his table, yea, many even belonging to the cook room, being of pure silver. Divers show us all sorts of curious workmanship.
The Elizabethans revelled in ostentatious ornament, what they called bravery, and Drake indulged in this as much as any other man. The Hind was brightly painted and decked out with streaming pennants and gaily coloured standards. She would have been a great prize were she not the flagship of the master privateer himself. The expedition set out in December 1577, ostensibly for Alexandria. Its real destination was a secret. The need for secrecy was nothing new to Drake, but it may have been that some of his companions were still unaware, even at the time of departure, that he had been appointed sole commander. This uncertainty could well have contributed to the unease felt by the accompanying gentlemen, who believed they had a greater role in the enterprise. Another source of agitation may well have been the increasingly imaginative and lurid marking found on their charts, which began to appear once past the Cape Verde Islands, such as Land of Demons and Terra Giganteum, though Drake landed in all these places and repeatedly diffused such apprehensions. Notably, when encountering natives in these places, Drake always behaved with honour and patience, even when one snatched the gold-banded cap from his head. But trouble brewed among the crews throughout the Atlantic Passage, and when they reached Port San Julian on the coast of Patagonia, where the gibbet Magellan had erected to deal with his mutineers appropriately still stood, things came to a head. Thomas Doughty was a soldier, a scholar, and Drake's friend. Yet, during the voyage, personal disputes between the two men had made Doughty persistently question Drake's authority. his flippant insubordination threatened to wreck the expedition. And so, displaying the essential ruthlessness of his character, Drake placed Doughty on trial for treason, with himself as prosecutor and judge, before a jury of 40 men. Though many doubted the legality of the court, Drake convinced the jury of Doughty's guilt and spoke persuasively in directing them to pass the death sentence.
And now, my masters, consider the voyage we are to make, the like of which was never made out of England before. For by the same, the worst of the fleet shall become a gentleman. And if this voyage goes not forward, which I cannot possibly see how it shall if this man live, what a reproach it will be, not only to our country, but especially unto us, the simplest man here must consider of. Therefore, they that think this man worthy of death, let them, with me, hold up their hand. Those that think him not worthy to die, hold down their hands.
Strangely, once the sentence had inevitably been passed, Drake and Doughty resumed their old friendship. Shortly before the execution, 2 days later, they took communion, then ate together.
They dined as cheerfully in sobriety as ever in their lives they had done aforetime, each cheering up the other and taking their leaves by drinking to each other, as if some journey only had been in hand.
But the execution did take place, and Drake, determined to assert his authority, did more than witness it.
Lo! This is the end of traitors!
The following day, as the chaplain prepared to deliver his sermon, Drake pushed him aside and took his place.
Nay, soft Master Fletcher, I must preach this myself. Although I have small skill in preaching, my masters, I'm a very bad orator, for my bringing up hath not been in learning. But so I shall here speak. Let any man take good notice of, and let him write it down. For I will speak of nothing, but I will answer it in England, yea, and before her Majesty. Thus it is, my masters. But we are far from our country and friends. We are compassed in on every side. Therefore, we're not to make a small reckoning of a man. We cannot have a man if we would give for him £10,000. If there be any here willing to return home, let me understand of them, and let them take heed that they may go homewards. If I find them on their way, I will sink them.
No more was heard from the troublemakers. A week later, Drake disposed of the smaller ships in the squadron and, in the Golden Hind, led the Elizabeth and the Marigold through the Straits of Magellan. After weeks of tensions and dissent, now expelled by the bloodshed at San Julian, Drake navigated the maze of islets in only 16 days. It was a great achievement. Magellan had taken 39 days. 10 years later, Cavendish took 49, then died of starvation during a second attempt. But following this, Drake's expedition sailed into harsh winter conditions, fierce gales and stormy seas. The Marigold went down with all hands, and the Elizabeth, separated from the Hind, turned back for England. Alone, the Golden Hind was driven south. On the 30th of August, the gales abated, and Drake sailed north to plunder the unprotected shores of the Spanish Empire. He began with a prize of Valparaiso, from which alone he extracted 25,000 pesos of gold, along with a great cross of emeralds. He then progressed up the coast of Chile and Peru. Raiding without loss of life on either side, he intercepted treasure the Spanish had stolen from the Incas and directed it instead into the hold of the Golden Hind. Drake's adventures at this time were as varied and exotic as the treasures he captured. They culminated in the capture of the great ship, the Cazafuego, described by the Spanish as the great glory of the South Sea. And great glories indeed she yielded to Drake.
Some fruit, conserves, sugar, meal and other victuals, a certain quantity of jewels, 13 chests of plate, 80 pounds weight in gold, 26 tons of uncoined silver, 2 very fair silver drinking bowls, and the like trifles, valued in all at 360,000 pesos.
The captain of the Cazafuego was well treated. Some of his cargo was even returned to him, and he was allowed to return to his ship on friendly terms. Drake became known along the coast as El Drac, the Dragon. In a letter to the Viceroy of New Spain, whom Drake had encountered at San Juan de Lua, one Spanish captain described his own meeting with Drake. I saw Drake walking on deck, and, on approaching him, I kissed his hands. He received me with a show of kindness and took me to his cabin, where he bade me be seated and said, "I am a friend of those who tell me the truth, but with those who do not, I get out of humor. Therefore you must tell me how much silver and gold does your ship carry." I told him none, only some plate I use and some cups. Drake then asked if I knew the Spanish viceroy, as it would give him greater joy to come across him than all the gold and silver of the Indies. Revenge had been Drake's aim for many years.
I am not going to stop until I have collected the 2 millions that my cousin John Hawkins lost at San Juan de Lua. Well, come on, man!
With his voyage made by such captures, Drake contemplated the return to England. Behind him was the treacherous passage through the straits, and the certainty of a welcome there by a squadron of Spanish ships. So instead, he sailed north until the cold drove him back to find a harbour, generally believed to be somewhere near San Francisco, where the ship could be refitted. There Drake tolerated the worshipful attention of the natives until July, when all was again made ready. Then, in 68 days, he crossed the Pacific Ocean. He landed in the Spice Islands, as Magellan had before him. There he made friends with the local sultan, who had recently quarrelled with the Portuguese, and won from him, for England, a monopoly of future trade to the islands. In December, after a month's rest, he departed only to run aground in the straits between Pelling and Sula. Drake lightened his ship by jettisoning 3 tons of cloves, a gift of the Sultan, and at the next high water it was miraculously lifted off unscathed. At around this time, Drake saw fit, for some unknown reason, to have his parson chained by his leg to a hatch on the forecastle, and treated to a sermon of excommunication, after which he was forced to wear an armband, on which was written,
Francis Fletcher, The falsest knave that lives.
The Hind then proceeded uneventfully along the coast of Java and across the Indian Ocean to the Cape of Good Hope. From there, Drake paused only at Sierra Leone before reaching Plymouth on the 26th of September 1580. The treasure he returned with is thought, staggeringly, to have amounted to at least £250,000 sterling in Elizabethan currency, and returned a dividend of £47 on every £1 invested in the expedition. Drake was knighted aboard the Golden Hind, and his reputation, like his expedition, was made. He became a member of the landed gentry, bought Buckland Abbey, and upon the death of his first wife, married Elizabeth Sydenham. He even became Mayor of Plymouth. But in 1585, Drake was called upon once more by Her Majesty. This time, Drake's services were required not as a freebooting explorer, but as a commissioned commander of the Navy, leading an expedition to the West Indies, where the Cold War with Spain had been steadily growing warmer. The expedition's purpose probably centred on the replenishing of the English colony at Roanoke, newly renamed Virginia by Sir Walter Raleigh. But Drake, as admiral aboard the Queen's ship Elizabeth Bonaventure, seems to have led as vaguely defined a mission as all the others he had been involved in. He certainly interpreted it, as usual, as one to loot, harry, and injure the Spanish wherever he found them. In this spirit, he sacked Vigo and Santiago and claimed any incidental prizes he encountered between them before, with some skill, taking the town of Santo Domingo on the coast of Hispaniola, now Haiti, and ransoming it back to the governor. He repeated this success at Cartagena. Here, Drake's sensitivity to status was shown when, after finding references to himself in a letter describing him as a corsario, he increased the town's ransom and threatened to blow it up unless it was paid in full. The people appealed to their governor, and Drake eventually received from him 107,000 ducats in gold bullion. Losing men by this time to yellow fever, Drake then bypassed Havana and sailed straight to Virginia. But the colony was not well established, and far from replenishing it, Drake in fact carried away with him most of the colonists who were disillusioned and afraid of Spanish reprisals. In fact, although the expedition was tactically exhilarating, Drake claimed, after reckoning up, to be out of pocket. More importantly, as a direct result of it, the Spanish began to build stronger defences in the West Indies, as, years later, Drake would to his cost discover. For some time after Drake's return from the Indies, the Queen attempted to continue the charade of disowning his actions. But Spain's plans to invade England soon became apparent. In 1587, Drake was given command of 7 ships, including once more the Elizabeth Bonaventure, and instructed, in the Queen's by now customary vague manner,
to prevent or withstand any enterprise against Her Majesty's dominions, with permission to distress the enemy within the harbours themselves.
Drake sailed, his spirits high and, to judge from dispatches, pleased with his crew.
All members of one body, for our gracious Queen and country against the Antichrist and his followers. The wind bids us away. Make sail, haste! Her Majesty's ship, Elizabeth Bonaventure, 2nd of April, 1587.
On the 16th, he was off Cadiz harbour, which was packed with preparations for an invasion of England. Despite the narrowness of the outer harbour entry and his vice-admiral, William Burroughs' fear of the galleys waiting within, Drake sailed straight into attack, wreaking chaos and destruction. Spying the flagship of the Marquis of Santa Cruz, designate head of the growing armada, Drake then sailed the Elizabeth into the inner harbour and destroyed that too. When the wind dropped, as Burroughs had feared, Drake was content to spend the night fending off Spanish fireships and plundering the other ships he found in the harbour. At 2 the next morning, the wind rose again, and he made his escape. He sailed south to the Straits of Gibraltar and there made landings at Lagos and Sagres. When Burroughs again raised his doubts, Drake had him arrested and sentenced to death upon his return to England. Then, without breaking stride, he moved on to Lisbon, where he baited the Spanish navy, hoping to draw it out of the impregnable port to fight. The Spaniards wisely remained where they were.
The Marquis of Santa Cruz, seeing us chase his ships ashore, was content to suffer us to stay quietly there and charge us with not one single shot.
Instead, Drake cruised the coast, rifling and destroying whatever smaller craft he encountered, all of which helped to slow and damage plans for the fitting of the Armada. This done, he headed, in a roundabout way, for home, dawdling in the Azores until he sighted a fully laden Spanish carrack, one of the newest types of ships rumoured to be in the area. This was the San Felipe, carrying goods worth £108,000, besides a casket of jewels. On encountering Drake, the carrack dipped her flag, as was the custom.
We, knowing what she was, would put out no flag until we were within shot of her. When we hanged out flags, streamers and pendants, that she might be out of doubt as to what we were. Which done, we hailed her with cannon shot, and having shot her through divers times, she shot at us. Then we began to ply her hotly. Our flyboat, one of our pinnaces, lay athwart her hawse, whom she shot and threw fireworks. Did not harm.
The San Felipe surrendered, and the biggest ship Drake ever captured returned to England with his fleet, marking the climax of his privateering career. Drake himself suggested that these latest exploits had merely singed the King of Spain's beard and only delayed the Armada. But after these 3 months of tactical success, which carried his name across the world, even the Pope, whose own blessings lay naturally with the Armada, was impressed. Were the Queen only a Catholic, she would be our best beloved daughter. Just look at Drake. Who is he? What forces has he? And yet he burned 25 of the king's ships. Yet on his return to England, the death sentence against his vice-admiral was dismissed, and Drake himself was reprimanded for the indiscreet brags and opprobrious words with which he had taunted the Marquis of Santa Cruz. Furthermore, against popular expectations, Drake was not appointed commander of the English fleet which would encounter the Armada, but instead vice-admiral to Lord Howard of Effingham. This appointment was probably partly to match the nobility of the new leader of the Armada, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and partly to avoid a clash between Drake and his equally strong-willed subordinate officers, such as Frobisher and Hawkins. To his credit, Drake accepted this without a complaint, and was civil to Howard throughout the affair. By 1588, the English fleet consisted of 102 ships of various sizes. Drake's Revenge, one of the heavily armed, manoeuvrable new ships, was one of 16 royal galleons. All the others, including a further 53 galleons, were privately owned. From the outset, Drake urged the Queen and her council to let him sail, knowing that the best defence against the Armada was to attack it on Spanish shores.
My very good lords, next under God's protection, the advantage and gain of time and place shall be the only chief means of our good. Wherein I do beseech your lordships to persevere as you have begun. For that with 50 sail a shipping we shall do more good upon their own coast than a great many more here at home.
But though he won over the council, it was not until other captains of the fleet backed him up that the Queen allowed this. By then, after 2 false starts, hampered by gales, it was too late. On Friday the 19th of July, while the English fleet sheltered at Plymouth, word arrived that the Armada had been sighted off the Lizard. If, as legend has it, Drake and his fellow captains were playing bowls at this time upon the Hoe, and if, on hearing the news, Drake truly said,
Play out the game. There's time for that, and to beat the Spanish after.
then it was very much out of character and against all wisdom. Drake would have known that he had to get his sheltering fleet to sea as quickly as possible, or be trapped and suffer the same fate as that which he had wreaked on the Spanish in Cadiz. Here, English seamanship, so vastly improved over the last 20 years, saved the day. Drake led the fleet across the path of the Armada into the very teeth of the gale and managed to take up a position behind it, thus turning the tables. The Spanish had almost won without effort. Now the English began to harass them. The Invincible Armada consisted of 130 ships. About 2/3 of these were armed transports for 30,000 soldiers and cavalry. The rest were warships, led by Sidonia's flagship, the San Martin. With her guard of oared galleasses in case she was becalmed, the San Martin formed the centre of a wing formation, with 2 squadrons of warships on either side. The transports followed behind in the centre, protected by squadrons of smaller ships at the rear, giving the impression of a crescent or half-moon formation shown in contemporary illustrations. The English, holding no particular formation, continued to harry the enemy for the rest of the day. Then, during the night, Drake's ship went missing from the fleet line. In the morning, he was discovered to have taken the damaged flagship of the Biscayan squadron. Although many found Drake's actions reprehensible, this was the only true prize taken during the battle. The Spanish ship's captain, Don Pedro de Valdez, sat at Drake's table for the rest of the action, following which he was ransomed. By Saturday, the Armada was off Calais, battered and in need of new supplies. By night, Admiral Howard sent fire ships into its midst. Weakened and demoralized, and sailing aboard ships loaded with open casks of gunpowder, the Spanish panicked. Most cut their anchors and ran for open sea. Those ships which were not immediately wrecked on the shore were attacked by Drake at what became known as the Battle of Gravelines. Here Drake himself led the 8-hour assault on the Sidonia's flagship, the San Martin.
Drake's cabin was twice pierced by cannonballs, and there was an occasion on which 2 gentlemen, who towards evening had retired to rest a little, and one of them lying upon the bed, when it was broken under him by a saker ball, without his taking the least hurt. And shortly afterwards, the Earl of Northumberland, who had come to fight as a volunteer, and Sir Charles Blunt, were resting on the same bed in the same place, when it was again hit by a ball of a demi-culverin, which passed through the cabin from one side to another without doing any harm than scrape the foot, taking off the toes of one who was there with him.
A day later, the wind changed, and the shrinking armada was able to flee north into the open sea. Drake and Howard chased it as far as Newcastle, then, encountering the foreign territory of Scottish waters, broke off. 64 Spanish ships were lost, among them 25 galleons. Around 10,000 men died. The triumph over the Armada was attributed by some to the weather, and therefore to God, Queen Elizabeth notably among them. But when the Spanish admiral reached Spain in September, his nerves shattered by his experiences, the jeering Spanish people invoked another name to taunt him. "Look out! Here comes Drake!" The Battle of Gravelines marked the peak of Drake's brilliant career as a fighting seaman and explorer. As his fame and reputation had grown, so had the name and standing of England. But as the Queen turned to consolidating her country's new position in the world order, Drake failed to recognize the subtle change in his own role which came with it. Drake had always been his own man, a savage, piratical phenomenon, directed by the Queen at the general target of Spain. Now that he was a respectable member of the Queen's navy, he became directly answerable for his often impetuous actions. Almost inevitably, only failure now awaited him. Immediately following the rout of the Armada, Drake was given the task of pursuing the remaining Spanish ships to their home ports and destroying them, with further instructions to capture Lisbon, then attack the Azores. For the first time, his instructions were unambiguous.
Before you shall attempt either Portugal or the Azores, our express pleasure and commandment is that you distress the ships of war in Guipagoa, Biscay, and Galicia, that they may not impeach you in such enterprises as you are to execute in the king's dominions, and so that they may do us no harm in your absence.
And for once, blame was all too easily attached to any deviation from those instructions. The expedition went badly. Sir John Norris, Drake's partner, was a veteran soldier, but knew nothing of administering a fleet of ships which, from the start, suffered from bad victualling. Then Drake missed the Spanish fleet at Corunna and, instead of pursuing it to its new port, chose to move on to Lisbon. There Norris's attack was unsuccessful and, under threat from the same Spanish ships he had failed to destroy earlier, Drake made for open sea. A further attack, this time on the town of Vigo, was also a failure. To make matters worse, Drake himself became entangled in court politics. When one of the Queen's errant lovers, the Earl of Essex, disobeyed her commands and joined the fleet as a volunteer, her anger at the poor captain who unwittingly gave him passage overshadowed the already shambolic expedition.
His offence is of so high degree that the same deserveth to be punished with death, which if you have not already done, then we will command you that you sequester him from all charge and service, and cause him to be kept, until you shall know our further pleasure therein, as you will answer for the contrary at your perils. These be no childish actions, therefore consider well of your doing herein.
With the Revenge by this time leaking badly, Drake returned home. Even such a failure was seen by some in a positive light.
We won a town by escalade. Battered and assaulted another. Overthrew a mighty prince's power in the field. Landed an army in 3 separate places in his kingdom. Marched 7 days in the heart of his country. Lay 3 nights in the suburbs of his principal city. Beat his forces into the gates thereof. Possessed 2 of his frontier forts. What are you looking at?
Queen Elizabeth felt otherwise. For disobeying her explicit instructions and wasting her investment of £50,000, she had Drake court-martialed. He was lucky, some felt, to escape with his head. Drake continued to play a part in public life, both as Mayor of Plymouth and as a Member of Parliament. But it was not for another 6 years that he was allowed to make another expedition. In 1595, the Queen heard rumours of a shipwrecked treasure ship off Puerto Rico. Optimistically, she dispatched Drake with a command of 27 ships, a command which he was required to share with his cousin Sir John Hawkins, who had not been to sea for nearly 20 years. The 2 men quarrelled immediately, and interrupted their voyage almost before it was begun to land at the Canaries. There a dispute over supplies was settled, but in so delaying, they narrowly missed an opportunity to attack the Spanish treasure fleet, and at the same time allowed word to reach the Indies of their coming, though by this time it mattered little. When the fleet reached the now formidably defended town of Puerto Rico, Hawkins, by now an old man, was dead of dysentery. After unfruitful raids on Rio de la Hacha and Nombre de Dios, towns which had played such a great part in his early life, Drake, now in sole command, attempted a further raid on the mule trains. This time his own force was ambushed and routed. He nevertheless strove to maintain morale among his men.
It matters not, man. God hath many things in store for us, and I have many means to do our Majesty good service, and to make us rich. For we must have gold before we see England.
He decided to try one last attack before returning to England, this time upon the newly established town of Portobello. But before reaching it, he himself fell ill. The Defiance anchored off the island of Escuedo de Veragua. There Drake became delirious, cried out against traitors, and strapped on his armour in order to die like a soldier. On the 28th of January, 1596, an hour after collapsing with exhaustion, he died. He was buried at sea, close by. Although Drake's death was widely and sincerely mourned, it was not at the time fully understood what a contribution he had made to the emergence of England as an international power. As the years passed, however, Drake and his achievement was not forgotten. It became rather, with time, an inspiration for the new race of English buccaneers which would soon set forth across every sea and raise the English flag upon every continent, establishing the foundation of what would eventually become the British Empire. To this day, in Buckland Abbey, among those few of his artefacts which have been preserved for posterity, Drake's drum can still be found emblazoned with his coat of arms. Legend tells us that, as he lay dying, Drake gave instructions for it to be placed in Plymouth Church, saying that, if it were beaten in times of danger, he would return. Whatever the truth of this story, many an Englishman on land and sea has sensed in the intervening years that in spirit Drake never truly left them at all.